The gentlewoman, the honorable woman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Green, for holding this hearing. It has been truly an honor to serve under your leadership on this subcommittee, from hosting you in the 13th District to this incredibly important historic work that you have tackled on and looking at the unthinkable horrors of slavery with the urgency that justice demands. So thank you so much, Chairman Green. I also want to thank our witnesses for their exhaustive research. Due to your work, we know the historical role of slavery in the financial industry is not abstract. The legacy of American slavery is still being felt in our communities across our nation today. We cannot look away. We must address these horrors. So that's why I really appreciate this subcommittee hearing. We look at financial institutions that responded to our subcommittee's inquiries. Of the 7 institutions that found historical connection to slavery, just two have taken any steps. Of these 2 institutions, Truist provided a public acknowledgement, and then JP Morgan created a $5 million scholarship fund. Those are the 2. To all of our panelists going down the line, yes or no, do you think these remediation steps are sufficient to acknowledge and atone for the role in American slavery? Dr. Darity?
Your volume, your microphone, Dr. Darity, please.
Sorry. No, I don't think that these are sufficient. And I have argued in the past that what financial institutions ought to do that would be a substantial act of atonement is to build the endowments of historically Black colleges and universities to a level comparable to their predominantly white peer institutions. I think that would be a step that would really be substantive.
You answered my second question, Dr. Darity, so I appreciate that. I do want to ask, Dr. Francis, do you think that these remediation steps by Truist and JP Morgan are sufficient to acknowledge an atonement for their role in American slavery?
No, I don't think they're sufficient.
Ms. Roberts?
No, and it also seems that the lack of response from other institutions is insufficient.
Absolutely. Dr. Rockman?
Insufficient.
Ms. Fetterman?
Insufficient.
And so my next question, and I know Dr. Darity discussed it, but what recommendations of what they can do to properly address their role in American history? Dr. Francis, I know you talked about a little bit about this, but what do you think that we can do as a subcommittee to push them towards the appropriate response?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think that financial institutions should commission studies to fully examine their historic involvement in and benefit from slavery. There should be greater transparency in the financial services industry regarding racial disparities and their current lending practices. Financial institutions should commit to funding and resources to community development activities in Black communities, and these efforts should be guided by local Black organizations. They should also review ways their current policies and practices may internalize and systemize racial discrimination in the form of race-neutral, wealth-related requirements. And I also will note that Dr. Fetterman had a lot of excellent recommendations in part 1 of this hearing regarding steps for atonement. But importantly, I think that these atonement activities should not be mistaken as reparations, which, as Dr. Darity mentioned earlier, involve a much larger federal effort.
No, thank you. Just so have some time. So, a critical part of the process is properly understanding the role and the value of slave labor and how it affected the overall labor market in the U.S. economy. So, Dr. Rockman, can you help us understand the effects of slave labor within the U.S. economy on the broader labor market? Could the unpaid labor of enslaved people have comparable value to paid labor at the time? Or did the very existence of unpaid labor fundamentally skew the entire labor market?
I would argue that the presence of enslaved labor in the U.S. South actually skewed the entire labor market of the United States as a whole, including setting some of the wage levels thousands of miles away in the North, but also in perhaps say, mitigating some of the class conflict that might have grown necessarily out of the development of the wage system. If we look at the transition to factory capitalism in Europe, we see massive conflict between workers and their employers through much of the 19th century. We see significantly less of that in the United States. What if it turns out, hypothetically speaking, that it's white supremacy and a commitment to keeping black people enslaved that created solidarities between white workers and white employers in the North that mitigated some of the bumpy political transitions that accompanied capitalism in the 19th century? That would change everything.
Yep, with that, I yield, Mr. Chair. Thank you so
Gentlelady,
much.
thank you. The gentlelady